Okay.
Okay, well, it's 4 o'clock. So let's go ahead and we can begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Scherf, and I am the Communications Director for the Center for Applied Linguistics. I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for joining the Center for Applied Linguistics today for this 30-minute webinar in our Critical Conversations Research to Policy and Practice series. This year, our theme is Multilingualism Without Borders. For 2023, we'll be looking at spaces where multilingualism is practiced across, through, and around all kinds of borders and barriers. Today's webinar is entitled Breaking Down Borders for Multilingual Learners with Disabilities. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto cal.org immediately after this event concludes. Also, there is closed captioning available for this webinar. Please press the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen to turn it on. The Center for Applied Linguistics is providing this event as a public service. However, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the persons expressing them and do not necessarily represent the views of the Center for Applied Linguistics. We are joined today by esteemed experts in their fields who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in language education, language access, and equity. We are very lucky to have so much knowledge on one call, and we encourage you, the audience, to ask us questions via the Q&A box below. We'll address as many questions as we can at the end of our discussion today. Also, you may click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen at any time to share your thoughts and comments. Go ahead and try it now and let us know where you're calling from. Finally, before we begin, please be sure to mute your microphone to avoid any interruptions during this presentation. I'll go ahead now and pass the microphone over to Dr. Justin Kelly, Senior Director for the Language Assessment Department here at Cal.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today. We have Laurene Christensen and Guillermo Solano-Flores with us, who will be sharing their research and perspectives on questions around improving assessment access and equity for multilingual students with disabilities. Laurene Christensen is the Director of Accessibility Research at WIDA. In this capacity, she leads WIDA's work in the area of inclusive assessment. Guillermo Solano-Flores, Professor of Education at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education, specializes in educational assessment and the linguistic and cultural issues that are relevant to both international test comparisons and the testing of cultural and linguistic minorities. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this important topic. We do only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Alfredo Artiles, the Lee Jacks Professor of Education at Stanford University and Cal Board of Trustees member, to ask the questions of our panelists.
Thanks, Justin, and gracias again, Laurene and Willie, for leading this conversation today. We're grateful for your time. As we all know, we are focusing on a timely and significant issue today, and we know that multilingual learners with disabilities face challenges in society from both their status as English learners and their disabilities. So I'm going to ask the first question and request that Laurene get us started with this. And the question is, what are the barriers to developing and implementing accommodations for multilingual learners with disabilities that your research seeks to address?
So I want to start out by thanking you, Justin and Alfredo, for having me here today. And I will go ahead and kick us off by saying that I think that one of the key barriers for students who are both multilingual and have disabilities is that sometimes we forget to look at them as individuals. And I think it's really important for us to focus on the individual needs that each student has. So I think oftentimes our multilingual learners with disabilities get sort of jumped into like a just a group and we don't actually think about the individual needs that the student has. In addition, I think there's also a tendency to focus more on the students' disability related needs at the expense of the students' language related needs. And so one thing that I have done some work on with some colleagues here at WIDA and prior to my work at WIDA is really thinking about how can we tease out both language related needs and disability related needs. And so we've included on the website for this webinar a framework document that can help you sort of think about individual student needs. And so I think that's a big barrier. And then another thing I just want to mention as we think about especially assessments and accommodations is really getting at what is the test trying to measure. I think that as we think about student needs, we really need to think about that as well, because I think that we need to be able to recognize that if the test is trying to measure, say, for example, English language proficiency, it might make sense not to have certain language related accommodations. But again, we really need to think both about the student as an individual and then about the test. So that's sort of my short answer to that question.
That's great. We're going to hear from Willie now.
Yes, from my perspective, there's a serious issue of incompatibility between what the legislation requires educators and practitioners to do with students with special needs and what the theory and practice says about what needs to be done. In other words, you may have 13 or 14 categories that classify students with special needs into different disability categories. But that does not necessarily mean that doesn't necessarily tell you what you have to do properly with these students. So there's always this tension between what the legislation requires you to do and what the knowledge in the field would say that you have to do with these students. The other problem that I see is heterogeneity. This is intrinsic. We know that linguistic groups are very diverse, even with the same first or home language. There are different histories and backgrounds and levels of proficiency in the second language, make them very heterogeneous. Yet we have again the same system of categories, 2 or 3 categories to determine to classify students within one of those. The problem of heterogeneity is very serious with the linguistically diverse populations. It is even more serious when you have issues of special needs, students with special education needs. So one of the big technical challenges that we need to address in our work has to do with how do we handle diversity and heterogeneity.
Thank you, Willie. And I think both of you have already started to identify major barriers that we face and already started to mention how your work is addressing these. So that's actually the next question. How does your research address these barriers? And I'm going to ask Willie to get us started.
Yes, thank you. Well, my research focuses on developing descriptive tools that allows us to describe what the student does in the specific assessment context. A lot of my work has to do with assessment and especially computer-based testing. So my work examines the kinds of interactions that the student has with the computer when they respond to items, to test items. We have seen that when accommodations are provided to students with special needs, that is great. The potential benefit is tremendous, but at the same time, the kind of interaction that the student needs to have with the computer is tremendously complex. So at some point, we need to balance what are the things that the student is required to do in order to benefit from an accommodation with actually the benefit that the student is getting from that accommodation.
Laurene, please.
Sure. A lot of my work lately has been focusing on decision making. So we've been looking at how decision makers on IEP teams make decisions about what assessment a student would participate in. Of course, my focus primarily is English language proficiency assessments. And so following from that work that we did related to assessment participation, we've also been looking at developing a study that's in the early stages, looking at how accommodations are determined for individual students. And we're particularly interested in thinking about that relationship between the content assessments and the English language proficiency assessments for IEP teams. Again, recognizing that there's some difference that needs to go into the decision making. We know that in many cases, it's really challenging to make individual decisions because educators might not have a lot of time. We know that there's other issues that are addressed in IEP team meetings. And so we really want to learn more about the factors that go into the decision making, the barriers that educators face, because I believe that we could be a lot more systematic in our decision making for our multilingual learners with disabilities. And so we're just undertaking this work, but I'm really excited about it, and I'll be excited to share more of our results in the near future.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that both of you are giving us food for thought in terms of issues that are connected to technical dimensions of assessments, as well as the social context of assessment. As we well know, is at the intersection of those two things that many things can go wrong. So we're going to wrap up the discussion with the last question, and we're going to start with Laurene. How can practitioners and other non-experts use your research to better advocate for change to benefit multilingual learners with disabilities?
Well, I believe that one of the most important things that we need to do to really affect change for multilingual learners with disabilities is to do more collaboration as a field. I think that we really need to have general education, special education, and English language development educators all in the room together, making decisions for the students, you know, with student input and family input, of course, as well. But we really need good, solid collaboration. And so one tool that I would like to just mention is that I've worked with some colleagues, Madison Leach, as well as Vitaly Sheehan, who works at Smarter Balanced, and we've developed a toolkit. I know that the link will be in the chat here, and there's some tools in there that can really help with that collaboration across general education, special education, and English language development. So as educators are developing their lesson plans, they can really think about what are the language related goals as they're working on content. So to me, that I think is a really critical area, is to support collaboration for the success of multilingual learners with disabilities.
Willie, please.
Yes, in my case, I would say that this is about the a lot of the work that I do and the impact that I want to promote is a support practitioners to think more critically about accommodations for students with special needs. Typically, you see that people are very happy when they hear that there's an accommodation available for students with special needs. And what they don't know is that the ways in which those accommodations are implemented may vary tremendously. The accommodations may not have been developed properly. The quality of the accommodation would vary tremendously depending on who develops those accommodations and so on. So it is not just the accommodation, there are so many things that we need to take into account. Among the resources that I would like to share with the audience is a chapter on a book on fairness and the idea of accommodations for students who are English learners. And the notion here is that even in the standards for educational and psychological testing, you see all this notion that, yeah, we want to promote fairness. We make sure that we have accommodations and certain activities. But many of those things are kind of just left to the developer's discretion. It would be nice if you do this and that. Whenever it's possible, try to do this, but never with the same level of rigor and the same level of, the same kind of expectations that you would have for other technical properties of assessments. So a lot of the work that I do has to do with showing that we need to think systematically and critically about accommodations for multilingual students with in special education.
Thank you both for this very insightful overview of these issues. I see lots of very good questions in the chat. Justin is going to facilitate this discussion. Please make sure that you see the link that Nick pasted in the chat for additional resources that Willie alluded to. Justin?
Sure. I've only seen 3 questions in the chat, and we do have several minutes, so I'm going to try to go down these in order. The first question from Gina Ramirez. Have you considered how integrated and designated ELD is being implemented with our students? So either Laurene or Guillermo, if you have a perspective on that.
I believe that I need a little bit more precision in the question, unless Laurene has understood, then I can follow you.
No, I was hoping for the same thing as well.
Okay, well, Gina, if you can put some additional information in the chat about the distinction between integrated and designated ELD, and maybe we can come back to that. All right, let me see here. From Jennifer Hartley, I see a lot of hesitancy to even decide to evaluate based on whether he or she is still learning English. I'm aware of the memo from the U.S. Department of Ed. The state schools cannot deny or delay evaluation based on English language learner status, but I still come up against a lot of resistance. How can I advocate more effectively for evaluation for multilingual learners?
I can start if that's okay with you, Laurene.
That sounds great.
Okay, so the way in which I see this issue is how we know that the assessment can potentially provide valuable information that is useful in supporting students. Okay, that is one aspect of the problem. The second aspect is to what extent are the classifications of students based on standardized test scores on English proficiency accurate? How many wrong classifications do we have? Students who should not be classified as English learners, and they are, or the other way around. So this essentially comes to leads us to the notion that we should, as educators, we should be using more sources of information than those that are required by law to make our decisions about the English proficiency of students. It is not sufficient just to depend on a measure from a standardized test that is required by law. We have to do it, that's fine. But we have to use other sources, and something that I have always promoted with colleagues and educators is we need to socially interact with our students so that we know how well we can communicate with them. If we just put them in a corner of the room, do not pay attention to them, and we just depend on the official classification of the students, that's not going to help them.
And I guess I would add that in my work, much of the work I do relates to multilingual learners who have significant cognitive disabilities. And in this area, I think that oftentimes we know when a student with a significant cognitive disability comes into school that they have a disability. We might not know the extent of the student's disability, but usually that is already known. And what we're trying to learn there is whether or not the student is an English learner. And some of these students have complex communication needs, and we might not, as adults, always have the right tools that we're using to communicate with the student. And so learning how to communicate with the student and giving the student appropriate tools so that they are able to communicate their needs with us is really important. And I think that, again, with the identification of this particular group of students, I think it's also really important to use multiple measures as well. So I think that's a key takeaway in the identification process.
All right, thank you both. So to follow up on the first question about how the implementation of integrated and designated ELD. So the follow-up is some of the concerns with supporting our emergent bilinguals who are dually identified. So when students are placed in a separate classroom setting, I don't see integrated English language development being implemented. So integrated with content instruction, and the designated English language development is also not being provided. So not having appropriate instruction provided to students is a possible reason students are not making gains. So is that part of your research?
I can start, Laurene, if that's okay.
Sure.
That is not exactly part of my research, but that is the kind of issue that I run into frequently. So I can tell you that one of the big problems with properly or the challenges for properly serving multilingual learners with special needs is that we may have in our heads or in the legislation or in the politicians' heads a very nice models of what to do with these students that are not necessarily connected with what is available in the schools, with what kind of training the educators have received, the kind of procedures that they are used to use with their students. So one of the things that I always tell colleagues or practitioners is try to think about something that is doable, that is within your reach, according to your resources. Try to always grow, of course. Try to develop and get the professional development that you need. But do not just assume that because you are adopting a model that is new and it's sophisticated, is going to necessarily fit your needs, unless it is within the realm of things that you can do to grow and to better serve your students.
And I would come back to collaboration here as well. I've done some research where I've, talked to educators in both special education and in English language development. And we know that there's not always a lot of professional development for special educators that supports their understanding of linguistics and English language development. Similarly, for folks who work in English language development, they don't always have good opportunities to have professional development in special education. And so I think that really taking the opportunity to learn from each other and really collaborate, I think, is a critical component here. And I know that somebody in the chat asked about, how do we actually do that collaboration? And so I would say two strategies that I would encourage is one, doing some collaborative planning. Again, the toolkit link that we gave has some examples of how you can do that. And also, I think, looking at some case examples of students or even you know, some short articles or other sort of things just to get the conversation started, I think can really be really helpful in terms of, you know, having a shared understanding and, you know, building a foundation together to understand how to work with individual students.
All right. Thank you both for your responses to that one. So I think, Laurene, you might have touched on this a little bit. Paula Mascot says, how can the double condition of multilingual and special needs student affect the diagnosis and therefore accommodations for students? And more specifically, what skills should diagnosticians and also teachers develop?
Sure. So I will say that it is not my area of expertise to identify students with disabilities. So I do know that we need to do a lot more work in that area in terms of really taking multilingual approaches to understanding students' disabilities. But I do think that as we think about accommodations, you know, we really want to think about the individual student. Sometimes students have preferences for one tool over another, you know, trying out different strategies or different tools. You know, a student might like using an iPad for an AAC device one day and really want to have a different kind of communication board the next day. So, you know, having some different options, I think, is really critical. And I would just add, since I'm talking a little bit about AAC, you know, being able to provide tools for students in whatever languages they use. So not just limiting those tools to English, but for multilingual students, having them available so that they're able to use the languages that they feel most comfortable in.
And if I may add, as you can see, this is all related to the issues of heterogeneity that I was mentioning before. Every student is unique in terms of what they can do and what they are interested in, their styles and everything. So trying to just depend on one specific measure is not going to help. So we need to be sensitive to that uniqueness, and that is not going to happen unless we socially interact with them.
All right. Nick, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Let's do one more.
All right, let me try to find one. There's so many good ones in here. Let's see. So, you know, this is one, and this is very appropriate and kind of like brings us back to the big picture. So in dual language immersion settings, what can be done to make administrators and policymakers understand that assessment should be holistic?
I think that there needs to be a continuous conversation so that people at different levels of decision can interact and exchange ideas. It is amazing when you interview people at different levels of influence, from classroom to school principals, school district superintendents, and also people in the Department of Education. They have different, not necessarily consistent views of what is going on and how effectively students are being served. So just the exchange of ideas, the communication, is a first step to make sure that we are all on the same line.
And I would add, understanding the purpose of the assessment, as well as the assessment scores. And again, coming back to multiple measures, knowing the student as an individual, I think all of those things really have to work together. Assessment is just one small piece of what we're doing with the education of an individual student, and really to be totally honest, as somebody who works in assessment, it's one of the least important pieces. Really knowing the student as an individual and being able to make those individual personal connections and helping them grow in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. That's what's really important. And I think that if we can focus on that, you know, we'll find that assessment can be more holistic, because it really is something that's happening in the day-to-day moment every day in the classroom.
All right, so let me find my script again. That's all the time that we have today. Thank everyone for being so engaged with this great conversation. I wanted to thank our wonderful guest speakers today, Guillermo Solano-Flores and Laurene Christensen, for sharing their insights and experiences. I'd like to thank all of the audience members for your questions and comments and enthusiasm around this important issue. We encourage you to share what you've learned today with your colleagues. And to that end, we will be sending a recording of this webinar to you via email. I think we'll also be sending out a link to the associated website that has other links. And we do realize that the feedback survey has not been working. So we will try to get that sorted out and send that out by email as well. Anything else, Nick, before we adjourn?
That is it. So just wanted to say thank you to everyone for participating in our webinar today. We do these webinars monthly. We'll send out more information about the upcoming webinar in our email to you. And we'll also share the link to that survey. So please feel free to take that and provide your feedback. We'd love to hear from you, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, friends.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye.